Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and this is In the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity. I'm here with one of my favorite co-hosts, my only co-host,
Woo.
usually, Sister Liz Schoberg.
Hello, hello. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you, sister?
Good. I am ready for this storytelling episode.
Yes, I'm so excited. I love storytelling. Anyone who knows me knows I can spin a good yarn, as they say. That's like that's like an old people thing to say. She spins a good yarn, that one, But I love storytelling. I love to tell stories. I like to hear stories being told. And so when I met this woman, Wakanyi Hoffman, who you'll hear about, I just knew I wanted to talk to her about this on the podcast. But she and I have shared, some kind of really COVID pandemic podcasting, not podcasting, but kind of Zoom calls and things. Tons of people were on all kinds of new groups and writing and things like that. And so I met Wakanyi in one of those groups, and I just knew this was a woman that I wanted to be friends with. And so, as I say in the beginning, she and I have never met. I have met her mother. I did go to see her mother, who lived close to
Cool.
us in New York, but I have not met Wakanyi, but she is a wonderful storyteller, and she'll tell you a lot more about that during the podcast. So we don't want to steal the thunder from her, but I know that you have a story
I'm
you want to
gonna.
tell
I
us.
Can I tell you a story right now
You can,
about
I love
how
stories. Yeah, tell me a story.
we went and saw Sister Act, the
Mm.
musical, at this local high school performing arts academy, and I was absolutely blown away by these children. Like amazing, high quality, great sound, the performance was fabulous, and I just said to people that we were going to fact check the Sister Act. That's what we were doing. We were there to fact check, and people were very delighted and happy that we had showed up to support Sister Act the musical.
I think
And
that
we
is
we took pictures
fabulous.
at the end too, which was a lot of fun with some of the
Oh,
cast.
are they like high school, grammar school? What
Yeah, high
grade?
school
Both?
kids, and they
Oh,
have this performing arts center, and it's really, really beautiful, high quality place. And so, I mean, these kids have been acting since they were 7 years old. So it's really something special.
wow. That sounds like it was really. Did you sing with them?
I was very tempted, but they actually
Oh,
didn't use the music from the movie. So that
um,
was one interesting fact about the musical, is that they don't use the music from the movie. So
well, you could have just gone up and done one because, if our listeners don't know this, Sister Liz has a beautiful singing voice. And we still haven't had her singing on the podcast. She gets a lot of other singers. I don't really understand why this is, but we will
more
get
to
that.
come.
More to come. So there'll be a singing episode. Right now, it's just the
Yes.
storytelling episode. So, Sister Act with the high school performing arts academy. That is
Yeah, it was
amazing.
great.
Yeah.
And you had a cultural experience recently also, right? You
We
want to
did.
share with the
Yeah.
group
So
here?
so we live in the area of St. Louis called Dogtown. And it's the Irish part of town. And the story is, of course, I may have said this before, that the many of the Irish who came to St. Louis were miners, like digging in mines. And the story has lots of different mythical kind of things. But the story is basically that they would have dogs with them that would help get them out of the mines or help them sniff out what they were looking for and things like that. So dogs were really important. And everyone in this neighborhood still has dogs. There's just dogs everywhere. But it's called Dogtown. But it's the Irish part of town. There are even shamrocks painted all over the street in our section of town. And there's like 3 Irish pubs down the street. And it's just great. Well, yesterday we were celebrating right after Mass. They even moved Mass up an hour in order to do this celebration. And so we were celebrating halfway to St. Patty's Day. So this was
Stop
the
it
get yourself
right
ready,
now.
anticipating the feast. That's what Father said at Mass. Come and celebrate the anticipation of the feast. Well, normally the anticipation of the feast is the night before, not a half a year before.
No, no, it's
So
okay. It's
we had
fine.
Irish music, and you have to understand our house sits beside what was the school. It's now a early childhood school. It's for little kids, little kids.
Yeah.
And so our backyard is the parking lot of the school. right? And part of the playground. So we're just surrounded by parking lot and playgrounds and this school. And so that's where they have the party is in the back of our house,
Right
literally
behind your house.
right behind our house. So we could have watched it from the windows, but of course we couldn't stay in the house. So we come out. You got to imagine like 8 sisters coming out of the garden area, right? Coming out into the lot where there's like, 100, 150. I think it topped out at like maybe 200 people by the night ended. And there's Irish music playing all night.
Mm.
And everyone's in green, dressed up in their Irish clothes. Yeah. So
And
that
you
was,
were the spectacle within a
well,
spectacle.
we weren't really. I think they just accept us. They know us well enough now, so we weren't quite as much of a spectacle. Although, of course, when we arrive, they're like, the sisters are here. And then they just kind of
Woo!
envelope you into the crowd. Yeah, but they had hamburgers and hot dogs and of course Guinness and beer flowing and music going and it was great. So we are, for all of those who care about it, halfway to St. Patty's Day. So get your green
Congratulations
on, get your green on, get ready. Yeah.
to all the Irish folks.
To all the Irish folks, that's right. And to everyone. Everyone's Irish on St. Patrick's Day, right? At least that's what they tell me. At least that's what they tell me. So in time, you will hear about the St. Patrick's Day parade, but we're not going to anticipate that much yet. We're just going to celebrate.
We got to anticipate this great episode
That's
that
right.
is happening
That's
right
right.
now with Wakanyi, and
Yeah.
this is great. You guys are gonna love it.
I think you'll love it. All right. Hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and I am in the company of Wakanyi Hoffman, who is becoming a good friend of mine. We have never met in person. We have met only on Zoom through a shared and common platform we've been engaging with called Service Space, which is something I'll have to talk about at another time because that is enormous in and of itself. But Wakanyi has been talking about, and we've been engaging in conversations around storytelling. And Wakanyi is both the creator of African Folktale Project, which is a website that has some of her folktales. She's written 2 books, which she'll tell us a little bit about, I hope, and has a podcast, Folktale Fridays, which is on Spotify. And so we'll have all the links to all of that. But I'd really love for you to meet my friend, Wakanyi. So Wakanyi, tell us a little bit about how you got started in storytelling. I mean, is this something you've done as a child? Is this something that happened? I know you also call yourself a global nomad. Has this been a way to hold on to the experiences of your nomadic life? Where did it start? And I guess in general, how do you see it as a way in which we can just do good things in the world? Because I know that you're a woman of great peace and intensity in these stories. So just talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's such an honor. And talking about storytelling, a subject that's really close to my heart. For me, how I see it, and I don't, calling myself a storyteller sometimes feels a little bit imposterish because I think we're all storytellers. And the way that I see it is that all our narratives are parts of the bigger story of humanity. And how I see this big story emerging is through connecting human to human. So whenever I tell a story, whenever I have a conversation with someone, I like to imagine that that's part of a bigger story that we're creating in the world. It may not seem like it's a story that might go far, but these are stories that are speaking to our condition, our being here as human beings. And how did I begin? How did I even get this sense of myself being a storyteller? Well, first of all, I grew up in a culture, in a community that has a very rich tradition of oral storytelling. So this would be my grandmothers and my aunts and everyone, literally everyone around me, still to this day. Every conversation is some form of storytelling, right? There's never a beginning nor an end. And really, when you meet with someone, even if you haven't seen them for a long time, there's always some story that we will bring back from the past, and it will connect to the current state that we're in. So conversations never seem to end. You almost have to put an end to a story so you can actually move on with your life. So for me, just from that early childhood experience of being shipped off to my grandmother's during the school holidays and spending so much time in rural Kenya, I just absorbed the stories from these ladies while we were out in the garden, which you call a shamba. We are out in the garden and they're all gardening or planting or taking care of the home, and stories kept them alive. It was such a natural and not conscious thing for me. I didn't realize that that's what kept us going, but that's what we all went to the upcountry for. All of my friends, all the kids that I grew up with, we'd all be shipped to our grandmother's places, and the things that we brought back were the stories. And it was just this sort of natural thing that we knew, oh, you're going off to your grandmother, you come back with stories. So I grew up this way, but I didn't realize how important storytelling was to me, or that I would even find it of value to share with the world until I had my own children. So truly the storyteller, Wakanyi the storyteller, was born with the birth of my children as well. So they came, as they grew up, my little one, my oldest one, when she was just a baby, I would find myself thinking about all the stories I can't wait to share with her when she grows up, because this then was obviously the way in which I knew how to be a mom, right? Is through storytelling. So I naturally gravitated towards the idea of, I'm going to share stories with my baby when she grows up. As much as someone from maybe a Western country would think, I can't wait to read a book to my little baby. So to me, it was, I can't wait to tell her all my childhood stories. And from there, it evolved into, I guess maybe I could even start something. So I started sharing stories with my children and their friends, and in the libraries of the schools that they went to, until eventually I thought, you know what, I'm just going to start some kind of research project and start collecting these stories, because they're not in written form, right? They're all stories that are mostly in my head or stories I can recall from my childhood. But to really find those stories, you'd have to go back and find the old ladies who are no longer there. And nobody's really telling stories in the way that I grew up anymore, where I grew up. So then that's how the storyteller in me was birthed, really, was through my own birth as a mother.
Wow, it's so, I love the point when you said, that in Western cultures, our tendency would be to go to the book first, that we don't do a lot of storytelling or story sharing even about our past and about our ancestors, or how we do some of it, but not a lot, and it usually is in book form, and we're not always sure where they come from. Right, we've been telling fairy tales for so many years, and then we stopped telling fairy tales because they were too scary. It's like, why are we telling kids these stories? So we don't have in the Western culture necessarily that same tradition, but I just find it to be so important. And the stories that you've told and shared on Service Space have always they just kind of wake me up, and say, oh, this is so beautiful, because there are so many traditions, and there are so many ways in which stories are not just about the past, or not just about our ancestors, but about the lessons that cultures and peoples have learned throughout history, and they're a way of handing on the traditions and the knowledge and the wisdom of our ancestors, who have lived and learned so much. And I had shared a little bit with you before we got started about St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louis de Marillac, and they are French, born in the 1600s, late 1500s, lived most of their lives in the 1600s, founded my religious community, the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and they didn't leave us treaties or deep spiritual books or stories or books about theology, or they left us letters. And for me, those letters became the story. And I'm always fascinated by how those letters, if you read just the letters to like one particular sister, it becomes a story of the relationship between St. Louise and this one sister, you know, and how they developed, because some of them are written very differently. The way she writes to Barb Angibu is very different than the way she writes to Elizabeth Martin. Now, you wouldn't know them, but some of the sisters who are listening would be like, okay, you know. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see modern storytelling, like how, or and again, I know we talk about kind of story capturing, story sharing. I mean, just that sense of story fitting in to contemporary culture, because my goodness, we lose everything on the internet, right? We're emailing and we're deleting and we're texting and tweeting and doing all these things, and even, you know, so much of the internet now is the shorter you can, the more you can fit into a shorter time, and then it disappears. How do you see that kind of storytelling being important now in a culture that seems to just let things dissipate and move on, and we're not preserving that ancestral wisdom?
Well, first of all, I get excited by the amount of or the number of media that we have for sharing stories, which is something that has sort of revolutionized the whole publishing or storytelling world. Everybody's telling a story. If you go on LinkedIn, everyone's telling a story. You know, there's storytellers. Everybody calls themselves a storyteller.
That's right.
Which really is who we are. So to some extent, I think that stories that were lost before, or stories that couldn't find a space to be shared, are now finding that free space, right? Now, are there stories that are taking more, are more prominent than others? Perhaps, yeah, if you look, you know, politically, right? You know, you always find news coming from one dominant country and not so many of the others. But I think at an individual level, I feel like there's a sense of empowerment whereby people are not afraid anymore to share their stories. So this idea of who you are or where you came from is becoming almost like a needed identity. Like a lot of people want to identify with where they're from, who they are. And so in that way, I feel like, and I don't know if this is happening in my little world of storytellers in my space, I feel as though there is a newfound desire to connect with your own identity. And that identity goes back to the generations of the people that came before you. It feels like globally, there's just a movement of finding one's true, authentic story. And that can only be found by researching and finding out who the ancestors were. So in a way, we are bringing back the voices of the ancestors, whether we're conscious of it or not, right? And I mean, I also operate in spaces where a lot of moms and parents are, and I do see a desire or a need for people to share with their children stories about their family lineage, for instance, right? And ancestry and all of that. All of that is storytelling. So in a way, to put it mildly, the ancestors have come alive through us. You know?
Yeah.
So while they're not here in person, they're coming alive through our desire to honor their having been here. And I know there's a lot of talk about, you know, the demise of the indigenous knowledge and how we've pushed that so far away that we're actually disconnected completely from them. You know, the world's population, only 5% is what makes up indigenous people. I mean, that's a very small, significant number of people that are still alive with all the knowledge. However, I believe I'm an optimist to, you know, to some level. I believe that knowledge, while we don't have access to it now with the people that are still alive that hold that knowledge, we have it in us. The minute you start looking back, digging into your ancestry, digging into who was my grandmother, what was she like, why did she make those decisions? that's a way of reconnecting with our indigenous ancestors, the people that were there before us. And I think that's the way that we're bringing these stories into the contemporary world. We're disconnected in the digital landscape, but I think we're reconnecting. I think it's necessary to disconnect to some degree, just so you can reconnect with your own self and find that who you are, who are my people, why am I here, what is the story that invented me, right?
Yeah.
What is the story that my mother told herself before having me, and why was that necessary? And I think that's the way that we're going to have to bring back our ancestors, bring back the knowledge that is somewhat forgotten but not gone. I don't think it's gone. I think it's there in all of us.
So tell us a little bit about these two books. Why these two stories? And you've told many, many, many stories. Why these two to publish? And are there others that you're thinking about publishing?
Sure. Yes, lots. So the 12 Days of Christmas Safari actually began a long time ago. It was again, like I said earlier on, the birth of me as a storyteller was at the same time at the birth of my first child. And Christmas is a big event in my family, certainly in my community, and certainly around me, everywhere we've been. And so I remember the first Christmas reading my little girl all the books that we had around Christmas. And there were a few in the 12, and the 12 Days of Christmas Carol, the song itself is, it's sung everywhere. So I remember having to sing that to her and thinking about that. And just as the years went on, as I had more children, we started making up a song of the 12 Days of Christmas. What if it was on safari? What if it was animals rather than all the other gifts? And so it became sort of a family tradition that every Christmas Eve we would start singing the 12 Days of Christmas, but our own Hoffman family version. And as I went on thinking about what would be if I ever was to publish a book, what would be the story that is most meaningful to me? And the 12 Days of Christmas Safari was just the most natural thing that I could think of. However, the real inspiration for the book came from seeing another book that was gifted to me by the author, and it was the 12 Days of Christmas in Thailand. And she had written that book, again, with the same thought as me. We actually sat down and had a little chat, and she said, well, I've read all this, 12 Days of Christmas and all the other stuff. But I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a 12 Days of Christmas in Thailand? Because she was living in Thailand at the time, and highlight all the different things that you find in Thailand, the spicy mango, or the tuk-tuks, or the monkeys in the temple, and all the rest of that. And I said, we have our own version of the 12 Days of Christmas, but on safari. So then when it came down to really thinking about publishing, I thought that would be a nice book that represents my thoughts and my feelings about how interconnected we are, right? Christmas is a Christian ceremony, right? However, at the same time, everyone around the world, whether you're in a Muslim country, if you go to Dubai during Christmas, you'll find Christmas trees and decorations and the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
In a very commercialized way. But on the flip side of that, or on the other side of that, is that people do tend to sort of relax and melt down, and cultures tend to understand each other better around that time. The buying and the gifting, and whether it's at the schools where you're giving gifts to your teachers, it's almost a given that it will happen around Christmas time, whether you believe in it or not. So I thought, the 12 Days of Christmas Safari would be my gift to children that want to also learn about what does the African landscape look like? Because I could have done the 12 Days of Christmas in Kenya, right? And just sort of highlighted city experiences and other things. But I really wanted to get into the heart of if we didn't have the material things that, we give, the gifts that we give during Christmas, what about the gift of nature? What would be the connection to nature around that kind of story? And so that's how it came about. And we thought about it, with my children, and we came up with the animals, and I found the illustrator in Kenya who was very excited about the project. So we did this whole, it was very collaborative. There was a lot of people involved. I came up with the story, but of course it's not an original story, right? The original Carol is a French or English folktale. So that's how it came about. And what it's now evolved into is this project about environmental conservation and wildlife conservation and introduction to African the African landscape. So it's taken on a whole different life form of itself. It's neither secular nor spiritual. It's sort of both, right? And that's what the essence of the 12 Days of Christmas Safari is. I do enjoy the idea that you can, the original idea of the 12 days beginning from the day of the birth of the baby Jesus and going forward. So that then becomes a little extra added story that you can carry on, right? So children can read the 12 Days of Christmas Safari starting on the 25th and going forward, and then can start to trace why that is. And so you can relate it to the actual, religious aspect of the story.
I loved it.
Thank you.
And I loved it because of the simplicity of it, but also because of the sense of the environmental connection. And of course, like right now, we're in the midst of the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has called the church to have the 7 years of meditating, praying, acting on his document, the Laudato Si, around the environment. And so that's really, really interesting to me. And this is just one more piece. I thought, oh my goodness, this would be a beautiful way to teach in our elementary schools, to get kids involved in thinking about this tradition of the 12 days of Christmas, being able to tell those stories, and then maybe be able to tell those stories in their own environment. As you said, somebody is talking about the 12 days in Thailand, the 12 days of Christmas on safari, the 12 days of Christmas in, rural America or in a city America, or, what would have been the 12 days of Christmas of my grandparents? What did that look like? So yeah, I just loved that. I loved that part of the essence of the book. And I think for me, that's the power of sharing these kinds of stories, right? And understanding where it came from, the genesis of it coming from your family, and having some changes in it, but also that it, no matter how it's told, it still gives us the same message around gift giving, around kindness, around recognizing gift as a precious way in which we connect and can just give thanks, basically, and give thanks for our families, the connections that we have. So yeah, I love that. I love that. So tell us about your other. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's about shared values, and I think that's what came to me throughout all these years, that my children and I would sit down and tell our own 12 days of Christmas. And we have several versions of the 12 days of Christmas, mind you, but this is our own, and it became this sort of evolving lesson about our world and how precious it is. And the animals that we selected for the book, a lot of them are endangered species, right? So then we wanted to highlight that. I would hope that if a child is reading that book, or if a parent is reading that book and sees a picture of a giraffe, that they would be interested to go find out more information, and then discover that, whoa, a giraffe is, just joined the list of endangered species. That's an interesting piece of information that maybe perhaps someone elsewhere would not have known had they not thought about it. So there's much to be explored through sort of, when you share a story, when you're inspired by one story, other stories emerge that you didn't even make a connection, but you start to see that it's all the same. Gift giving, value giving, right? So that's the other side of it. Where do we place the value? It's all how we tell these stories, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's
So
beautiful.
my second book is and it just got published recently. It's a Legend of the Dancing Baobab Tree. And that is actually part of it's the first of a series of books that will be published through the African Folktales Project. So it's the first of the folktales that we want to be able to send out to the world. And so the story of the dancing baobab tree is, it highlights some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm.
So the point of these folktales, they're not only, obviously they are entertaining, and it's interesting to know what the indigenous African ancestors, how they taught their children, and the kind of knowledge systems that they had, and the stories that they used to teach about whether it was about the land or the people, social issues or family units. But I wanted to really focus on something that everyone in the world is concerned about currently. And it took me a while to get around how exactly do I present these stories to the world? Because some of them might not even be relevant, right, to other cultures. And then as I was doing this research, because it came out of my master's program a long time ago, as I was thinking about indigenous knowledge systems, I found a connection between indigenous knowledge and the challenges of finding solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And all of a sudden, I found that actually all of these stories were focused on the solutions that we're now working towards finding. They were already embedded in the storytelling. They were embedded in all these folktales. So I went back to the folktales and I started researching and trying to find some of the stories that are directly linked. You know, I can see a direct link between SDG 16 and a story, you know, that sort of thing. And so one of the stories is the legend of the dancing baobab tree. And this folktale is told all across Africa. I can't find the original storyteller because the story is spread out in the continent. And it really focuses on this idea of shared resources on the planet. So it naturally became my first story that I wanted to publish as the first in the series. And the story itself starts off with a tree, the baobab tree, which is in Africa, in most African communities, it's a recognizable tree and, you know, revered for its size. You know, it's enormous, and how long it lives, hundreds of years, and how many stories are told under the baobab tree or inside the baobab tree. I mean, this tree can be turned into a house or a station or, you know, a parking lot and all sorts of things. So that to me was one of the stories that I felt was quintessentially African folktale, and at the same time with such a global message, right? This idea of we all live on this planet and we all share the resources. Because in the story, the baobab then is sort of the protagonist of the story, you know, takes all this water resource from the underground, stores the water in its big trunk, and everything else around it is dying, the animals, and everybody's angry with the baobab. And then eventually they pull it out of the ground and, you know, whisk it into the air and comes back upside down, and all the water comes out and the savanna is restored. But the original story is actually has a spiritual element to it, you know, where it is sort of, the idea is that, you know, if you mess around with nature, then nature is going to fight back, right? And that's what happened to the original baobab. So it came back upside down, and in my story, the baobab was dancing because it went around dancing everywhere. So anyway, so that's the story. And what I want to do with this, because like I said, it's a series of books. And at the moment we have about 10 stories. They're very specific, and they're very specifically tied to the SDGs. Because the point of it all is to introduce indigenous knowledge into the mainstream education system. And I think the only way to do that is to bring those stories into where the children are, rather than expect the children to go back to where the stories are, because that's not going to happen. But if I can in some ways, provide this bridge between the indigenous story keepers or indigenous educators, right? Informal educators, and the formal education system, then in a way, the indigenous knowledge will find its place, its rightful place. And then we can start talking about these solutions while considering other ways in which these solutions have been in the past, have been found in the past. And that's where the storytelling really, to me, comes alive. Because I just don't see any other way of introducing that level of knowledge that is so informal and scattered and it's not written down. Why not bring it into the mainstream in the form that it is best presented, which is orally? So actually the book, the Legend of the Dancing Baobab book, I wrote it because I wanted it to be something tangible, something you can hold. However, my hope is that anybody reading the book, any educator using it in their classroom, will actually use it as a reference to start telling stories, to start writing their own similar stories, because that was the point of oral storytelling. It was never, there was no ownership of stories, which is why you can't trace the original storyteller, because that wasn't the point. The point was for me to pass the story to you, you tell it to the next person, and by the time it reaches the 100th person, we have no idea what the original story was, but the message remains the same, and it is adapted to suit the current times you're in. So that's the point of the African Folktales Project and the stories that I want to bring out into the world through the project.
Thank you so much for your time, and I hope when the new book comes out, we can have you back again.
Thank you so much, Sister Elizabeth. That was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.